This is a video game I'm working on, and as cool as it might look, it's missing something very important, which is some enemies for the player to fight. I've tried making enemies before, but they've never really turned out great, and so I decided to spend the last 3 months in the trenches creating an awesome lineup of enemies for this game. Now before we make all the enemies, I want you to say hello to Bob. In order to make enemies, we're gonna have to start by doing some experiments on him. And the first thing he needs to do is move. Now making an enemy move is pretty simple, right? All you do is bake a nav mesh, which is like a map that tells enemies where they can and can't go. Then you tell those enemies to use their pathfinding to just go to the player. I mean, it's simple enough, and this is how I've always done it. But it kinda sucks. To understand why, you can see how satisfying the physics on these cubes is. Shooting them wouldn't be nearly as satisfying if they just didn't react. However, when we do the same thing to Bob, even a whole rocket launcher doesn't make him budge. So how do we give Bob physics while also letting him move using Unity's nav mesh? Well, I decided to calculate Bob's target position with his nav mesh, but then move him on my own using forces to kind of nudge him in the right direction. With this system, we can finally knock Bob around. Now, some of our enemies are also going to need to fly, and this might sound simple enough, except for the fact that Unity's pathfinding doesn't support flying enemies. Up until now, all I've been doing is I've just moved the enemy model up in the air, so even though the enemy is technically walking on the ground, it looks like it's flying. The enemy is basically glued to its height, and I can't stand knowing that these flying enemies can't actually fly. But guess what? Just like how we used physics for pathfinding, we can use it to push enemies up into the air and make them fly. And so that's exactly what I did. But even with all these features, Unity's pathfinding still causes Bob to get stuck behind different platforms that he should normally be able to get onto. Peekaboo. The most straightforward way to fix this is to manually place jump points around the level, so that Bob can use them to jump between certain platforms. Except this kind of sucks because hand placing every jump point between every platform on every level is kind of annoying, and I'm not exactly about to do that kind of labor. Instead, I programmed a new pathfinding system that pushes Bob up and over platforms if he ever gets stuck behind them. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I genuinely started dancing in my apartment after I got all these features to work, because I've been chasing this level of pathfinding for 3 years, and up until now, I've never really been able to get it just right. But to be honest, pathfinding is only half the battle. Now, I honestly have no clue how other developers make enemies, but I previously created a really cool system that allows me to just add any attack to any enemy. Just as an example, if I want Bob to shoot me, I just add a bullet behavior to his behavior array, and then add the script for bullets. And just like that, Bob can now shoot me. I honestly love this implementation, so I didn't really change much here, but there's still a problem. I have all of these different attacks from my old attempts at making enemies, but these attacks honestly suck. For example, this is the pulse behavior, which just pushes the player back. As you can see, it works totally fine, but it doesn't feel good at all. There aren't any effects or animations or anything to really indicate a pulse attack. This was a similar problem that almost every other attack in the game had. Now, it's kind of repetitive, but I basically went through every attack and improved models, added animations, nice effects, and made enemies telegram their attacks. Just as an example with the pulse, I added a particle system, applied a downward force, and added an impact effect. But yeah, I kind of went through that process with every attack that I created so far. The shield ability also received a lot of love. The old one was cool, but it was kind of hard to see. This time I did something a little bit weird, but I basically made a cutout, gave it some light, and then put it behind the panels. But it actually turned out pretty cool in the end. But yeah, with pathfinding and attacks completed, I think it's time I show you guys the lineup. Now, I'm not going to go through every attack of every enemy since that cooked the retention last time, but you can get a basic idea of how these enemies behave from what you can see on screen. For those of you who have seen my earlier attempts, you'll notice some pretty clear similarities and differences. Some enemies, like the tank, are pretty much unchanged, while enemies which I used to hate have gone under some pretty radical design changes. In my older videos, I remember some of you recommending that I try and give the enemies more character. This might sound a little weird, but even though these enemies are robotic machines, a lot of you recommended that I design them less like objects and more like characters. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest improvements came from one of the smallest changes. These little orbs might have caught your eye, but I've been using them to almost act as the eyes of these enemies. Normally, I would have just used a glowing circle for the eye, but while playing around with some vertex shaders, I actually got this really cool effect, and it looks so much better. Now, before we can truly finish making enemies, we need to make them die in style. I started by creating a bunch of random, small fragments that enemies could spawn when they die. But obviously, an entire tank won't just turn into some small pieces, and so the next step involves creating a destroyed version of every enemy model. This might sound really tricky, but the way I did this was I fragmented the enemy models, got rid of some little pieces here and there, and then combined the remaining pieces into a single model using this free asset, which I'll have linked in the description. But yeah, after applying that process to all the enemies, the new destruction felt so much better. Now, just before I go, I want to share a quick update on the roadmap. I'm honestly not as efficient of a developer as I thought I was, and so I've ended up stretching everything out just a little bit. I know it took me a whole month longer to finish enemies, but this was also one of the biggest things standing between me and finishing this game, and now that it's mostly out of the way, I think we're going to see some awesome progress in the months to come. This next month is going to be all about creating tons of little props and things the player can interact with, which I can then just throw around my levels to increase immersion. But yeah, sorry to keep you guys waiting. Thank you for watching, and if everything goes to plan, you'll hopefully see me again next month.